Jamal Carter had seen a lot in his years as a police officer, but nothing quite prepared him for retirement in a quiet suburban neighborhood, especially when it came with an uninvited guest. The first time he saw the woman waiting in his pool, he thought he was imagining things. Middle aged, platinum blonde, and draped in an oversized sun hat, she lounged on a pink flamingo float, sipping from a glass of wine as if she owned the place. He stood there for a moment, gripping the sliding door handle, watching her. He had dealt with entitled people before, but this was a different level of audacity. She had a serene expression, tilting her head back as if she were at a luxury resort instead of trespassing in his backyard. A part of him wanted to see how long she would continue undisturbed, but his patience was short-lived. "Excuse me," Jamal called out, stepping onto his deck. "This is private property." The woman barely looked up. She took another sip of her wine and exhaled dramatically. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just a pool." Jamal clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "It's my pool," he said, stepping closer. His voice carried the no-nonsense authority that had once been enough to make criminals freeze in place. But not her. No, she just lazily paddled toward the edge, her perfectly manicured fingers skimming the water. The woman sighed as though he had just asked her to do something exhausting. "I'm Karen," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Your neighbors told me you're hardly ever out here. It seemed like a waste." Jamal's patience wore thin. "I don't care what they said. You need to leave." Karen rolled her eyes, making no move to exit the water. "Oh, come on," she said, stretching her legs out in front of her, toes pointed like a ballerina's. "I just wanted to cool off for a bit, and it's not like I'm hurting anyone." Jamal inhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. He had spent years de-escalating tense situations, but never had he imagined using those skills in his own backyard against a trespassing woman who acted like she owned the place. "Listen, Karen," he said, his voice measured. "I'm asking you nicely. Get out of my pool and don't come back." Karen finally sat upright on the float, her lips curling into a smirk. "Or what?" she asked. "You gonna call the cops? Oh, wait, you used to be one, right?" Jamal's expression darkened. How did she know that? He hadn't shared much about his past with his neighbors, preferring to keep his life quiet and private. A flicker of unease passed through him, but he pushed it aside. It didn't matter how much she knew. What mattered was getting her out. He stepped down onto the poolside tile, towering over her. "I won't ask again." Karen finally sighed and kicked her legs, sending ripples through the water. She maneuvered toward the steps, stepping out of the pool with the grace of someone who had no shame. As she grabbed a towel, his towel, off a nearby chair, she winked. "See you around, neighbor." Jamal stood there, watching her walk away, water dripping from her body, leaving a trail of wet footprints on his deck. Something in her demeanor made him uneasy. This wasn't just an entitled neighbor. Something was off. That evening, Jamal sat on his back porch, a cold beer in hand, staring at the pool that had suddenly become contested territory. The water was still now, no longer disturbed by the unwelcome presence of Karen Whitmore. But he knew it was only a matter of time before she tried again. He had encountered people like her before, people who mistook kindness for weakness, who pushed boundaries just to see how far they could get. He had retired from law enforcement to escape that kind of nonsense, but it seemed trouble had a way of finding him, even in a quiet neighborhood like this. He took a slow sip of his drink, exhaling through his nose. Maybe she had gotten the message. Maybe this was over. The next morning, Jamal decided to put an end to it once and for all. He drove to the hardware store and bought a new padlock for the gate leading to his backyard. Then he installed a motion-detecting camera facing the pool, its red light blinking like a silent warning. He even placed a "no trespassing" sign on the fence, just in case she tried to play dumb. That night, he slept soundly, convinced he had secured his space. But the next morning, when he checked the camera feed on his phone, his stomach twisted. There she was. Karen had come back, just as bold as before, slipping through the gate sometime around midnight. The camera had caught her stepping out of the pool, shaking the water from her hair and laughing to herself as she wrapped one of his towels around her shoulders. The audacity of it was almost impressive. Almost. Jamal exhaled slowly, setting his phone down on the counter. She wasn't just ignoring his warnings. She was testing him, seeing how much she could get away with. That afternoon, he walked over to her house and knocked. Karen opened the door with an exaggerated sigh, as if she were already exhausted by his presence. She leaned against the frame, dressed in a crisp white blouse and jeans, a wine glass dangling from her fingers. Well, well, if it isn't Officer Carter, she said smoothly. To what do I owe the pleasure? Jamal wasn't in the mood for games. You were in my yard last night. She tilted her head. Was I? He pulled out his phone, showing her the footage. She watched with mild amusement, sipping her wine. When the clip ended, she smiled. Oh, come on. You're not really mad about that, are you? I put up a lock, a camera, and a sign, Jamal said evenly. You're trespassing, and now you're on record doing it. Karen sighed dramatically. You are such a killjoy, Jamal. She placed a hand on her hip. You know, I could go to the HOA about this. There's a rule about shared community spaces. Jamal narrowed his eyes. That's not a community pool. She shrugged. Maybe not, but I have friends on the board, and they'd love to have a conversation about who gets to use what in this neighborhood. Jamal held her gaze. And I have friends on the police force who'd love to have a conversation about trespassing charges. For the first time, her smirk faltered, just slightly. He took a step closer. Consider this your final warning. Karen pursed her lips, then smiled again, but there was something in her eyes, something calculating. She took another sip of wine, then slowly closed the door without another word. Jamal exhaled sharply and turned back toward his house. He had a feeling this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jamal had dealt with persistent criminals before, but Karen was something else entirely. She wasn't stealing, she wasn't vandalizing, she was just invading. Boldly, shamelessly, and with a smugness that made his blood simmer. He had given her a final warning, but he knew deep down it wouldn't be the last time he saw her. People like her didn't stop just because they were told to. They stopped when they were forced to. That night, he barely slept. Every creak of his house, every rustle of the wind outside made him alert. He had lived a life of caution for years, always watching his back, always prepared for the worst. And now, after retiring, he found himself in the same mindset. But this time, the threat wasn't a hardened criminal. It was a suburban trespasser with a superiority complex. At 2:47 a.m., his phone buzzed. The motion detector had been triggered. Jamal sat up immediately, grabbing his phone from the nightstand. The live feed showed his pool, still and empty, but the gate was swinging slightly, as if someone had just passed through. His pulse ticked up. She was back. Again. He didn't hesitate. Throwing on a pair of sweatpants and grabbing the flashlight by his bed, he moved through the house, his steps silent and controlled. He reached the back door and peered out. At first, there was nothing, just the glow of the pool lights casting shimmering reflections on the water. But then he saw movement, just the faintest shift of a shadow. He unlocked the door quietly, stepping outside. The night air was cool, the scent of chlorine thick. His gaze swept the yard, scanning for any sign of her. He was done playing games. Karen, he called out, his voice calm but firm. I know you're here. Silence. Then the sound of water shifting. His grip tightened on the flashlight as he stepped closer to the pool's edge. And there she was, partially submerged, her face barely above the water, watching him with an eerie stillness. The sight sent an unsettling chill down his spine. You're trespassing, he said. Again. Karen blinked slowly, a lazy smile curving her lips. It's such a beautiful pool, Jamal, she murmured. Feels like a waste for just one person. Jamal's patience snapped. I told you to stay out. This is the last time I'm saying it. Karen tilted her head, her wet hair clinging to her face. Or what? She asked softly. You'll have me arrested? That would be quite the scandal. Retired officer gets woman locked up over a pool. Doesn't sound too good, does it? Jamal clenched his jaw. He had dealt with manipulation before, but there was something else beneath her words. Something deeper, something more dangerous. He stepped back. Get out. Now. She sighed dramatically, then slowly swam toward the edge, pulling herself up with deliberate grace. Water dripped from her body as she stood, her gaze locked onto his. You really don't like sharing, do you? She murmured. Jamal didn't respond. He just watched as she grabbed another one of his towels again and wrapped it around herself. Then, before he could say another word, she leaned in, so close he could smell the chlorine on her skin. This isn't over, she whispered, and then she walked away, disappearing into the night. Jamal locked the gate himself that morning, double-checking the heavy-duty padlock he had installed just a day prior. His patience was running razor thin. He had spent his career dealing with people who pushed limits, but something about Karen unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just entitlement, there was something deeper, something calculated in her defiance. He had encountered criminals who tested authority before, but Karen wasn't after money or valuables. She was after control, his control, and that made her dangerous in a way he hadn't prepared for. By the afternoon, he had called an old friend from the force, Detective Miguel Rivas, and invited him over for a beer. If anyone could help him figure out how to legally shut this situation down, it was Rivas. "Man, I thought you retired to relax," Rivas joked as he leaned back in a patio chair, popping open his beer. "Didn't take long for drama to find you, huh?" Jamal exhaled through his nose. "You have no idea." Rivas glanced at the pool, then at the new locks on the gate. "So this Karen woman, she just invites herself in like she owns the place?" Jamal nodded. "She's done it 3 times. Last night, she was hiding in the damn water like some kind of horror movie villain." Rivas chuckled. "Creepy." Then he sobered. "You file a police report yet?" Jamal hesitated. "Not yet." Rivas arched a brow. "Why not?" Jamal took a sip of his beer. "Because that's what she wants." Rivas frowned. "Come again?" Jamal sighed. "She keeps pushing, keeps provoking. But she's not stupid. She knows the law. The second I escalate, she plays the victim. She's the type that thrives on drama, loves twisting things to make herself look like the innocent party." Rivas shook his head. "Yeah, I've dealt with people like that. They push just enough to stay out of legal trouble, but never enough to warrant an actual charge." He took another sip. "Still, if she keeps trespassing, that's a crime. You don't have to play her game. Just document everything and let the law handle it." Jamal exhaled. "I put up cameras, got footage of her sneaking in, but she doesn't seem to care." Rivas was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward. "Then maybe it's time to make her care." Jamal's gaze sharpened. "What do you mean?" Rivas smirked. "People like her? They hate looking bad. Public humiliation works better than the law sometimes." Jamal considered that. The idea of exposing Karen for what she was had merit. She played the role of the innocent neighbor, but what if the whole neighborhood saw what she was really doing? Later that evening, Jamal set up a plan. He angled his cameras to capture the best footage and waited. He knew she'd be back. She was predictable in her defiance. Sure enough, at 1:13 a.m., his phone buzzed. Jamal sat up, pulling up the camera feed. There she was, slipping through the gate, except this time she struggled with the new lock. He watched her frown, then produce something from her pocket. A key. Jamal's pulse spiked. How the hell did she have a key? She fumbled with it, but the lock was new. It didn't match whatever key she had. After a moment, she huffed in frustration and, to his shock, reached into her bag and pulled out a pair of bolt cutters. Jamal didn't hesitate. He moved fast, slipping outside with his phone recording. The second he rounded the corner, his flashlight beam landed on her, illuminating her in a stark white glow. Karen froze, the bolt cutters still in her hands. "Well," Jamal said, his voice low and cold, "this is a new level, even for you." Karen's eyes flicked to his phone, realizing he was recording. Her expression didn't show fear, though, just mild irritation, as if he had caught her doing something as harmless as jaywalking. "Oh, please," she scoffed, lowering the cutters. "You're being dramatic." Jamal took a step closer. "You're breaking and entering, Karen." She rolled her eyes. "It's a gate, Jamal, not Fort Knox." Jamal didn't lower his phone. "I've got you on video trespassing. Again. You really think the cops are going to side with you this time?" Something flickered in her expression, just for a second. Then she smiled, slow and smug. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe not. But you're not going to do it, are you? You're not going to call them." Jamal's jaw clenched. Karen tilted her head, studying him. "Because you know how this looks, don't you? A retired cop intimidating a single woman in the middle of the night? You record me all you want, but the moment this turns into a legal battle, who do you think the HOA is going to believe? Who do you think the local news is going to paint as the aggressor?" Jamal's grip on his phone tightened. Karen took a slow step toward him, her voice softening. "You should just let this go, Jamal. I like the pool. And you like your peace and quiet, don't you?" He stared at her, his pulse thudding against his ribs. Then she leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Be smart. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows like nothing had happened. Jamal stood there, muscles tight, heart pounding. This wasn't just an entitled woman pushing her luck. This was something else, something darker. Jamal didn't sleep that night. He sat in his living room, staring at the footage of Karen breaking in over and over again. Every instinct in his body told him she was dangerous. Not in the way criminals on the streets had been, but in a way that was even harder to fight. She didn't need weapons or brute force. She was a manipulator, someone who knew how to twist reality to suit her narrative. But Jamal wasn't a fool. He had spent his entire career dealing with people who thought they were untouchable. And he knew one thing for sure: everyone had a weakness. The next morning he went to work. He compiled every video, every interaction, and every bit of proof he had. Then he sent it out to the police, to the HOA, and most importantly, to a few neighborhood social media pages. He didn't add commentary. He didn't frame it with accusations. He just let the footage speak for itself. By noon, the storm had started. Neighbors commented in shock. Some defended Karen at first, insisting she was harmless, but as more clips surfaced, her sneaking in, her using bolt cutters, her smug defiance, it became harder to deny the truth. Then the HOA stepped in. Jamal had barely finished his lunch when he got the email. Effective immediately, Karen was banned from using any neighborhood amenities, including the community pool. More importantly, they were launching an investigation into her behavior, citing multiple complaints from other neighbors who now felt emboldened to speak up. Jamal exhaled. It wasn't the dramatic takedown he had once envisioned, but it was enough. For now. But Karen wasn't done. That evening, as Jamal sat on his patio watching the sun dip below the horizon, he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. He turned just as Karen stepped into view, arms crossed. "You think you've won?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. Jamal studied her. For the first time, there was no smugness in her eyes, only something colder, more calculating. "I didn't do anything but show people the truth," he said. Karen smirked, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You think they'll always be on your side?" "People forget, Jamal. They move on. And when they do..." She trailed off, tilting her head. "Well, let's just say some of us are very, very patient." Jamal kept his expression neutral, but his gut told him this wasn't an empty threat. Karen stepped closer. "You ever hear the story of the frog in the boiling water?" she murmured. "You don't drop the frog in when it's hot. You let it simmer, slowly, until it doesn't even realize it's being cooked alive." Jamal clenched his jaw. "Are you threatening me?" Karen chuckled, shaking her head. "Oh no, I'm just reminding you. Some battles aren't won in a day. Some people, they like the long game." She turned, walking away into the night like she had so many times before. Jamal sat there, watching her go, his mind turning. He had won the battle, but Karen had just made something painfully. This wasn't over, and some enemies never really go away.